Hi, hello there, welcome or welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, my name is JJ and I love wrestling. And this is episode 2 of my series, The Hardest Gimmick in Wrestling. Episode 1 focused on the foreign menace. It can be found in the playlist below, but this is just a little series where I want to talk about the specific character gimmicks you most oftenly see in wrestling and which ones I think can be the hardest to sell or the hardest to pull off. And my perspective here is coming from that as a professional writer and also someone who in the past studied and did things like theater, improv, independent filmmaking, etc. And so our episode today is going to be about the InSaNe heel. And I think this might be the hardest heel gimmick in wrestling. So let's jump right. I think insanity is one of the easiest things to indicate, but one of the hardest things to embody. A lot of performers mistake crazy for randomness. So you end up with wide eyes, head tilts, fake laughing, sticking tongues out, talking in spooky riddles, sudden screaming, blood gimmicks, twitching, all the kind of hot topic, Tumblr, Joker adjacent shorthand of insanity. But real unpredictability almost never looks like someone trying very hard to appear unpredictable. The audience can feel the effort bubbling underneath, and the second your audience sees the gears turning behind your performance, like, okay, now do the creepy laugh, all of the illusion and all of the magic of wrestling dies. Now, in wrestling specifically, this problem gets amplified because wrestling already lives in a space of heightened performance. Everyone is already taking a character and projecting those traits at 150%. So if someone's only tool for unhinged or insane is to act weirder and louder, they overshoot into theater kid territory very quickly. The gimmicks here that work when pulling off insanity usually have a few key things in common. First, they have an internal logic. The character may seem irrational to us as a viewer, but they're always rational in the mind of the character. That's why someone like Mick Foley as Mankind worked. He wasn't spooky or crazy. He felt damaged, lonely. He felt needy, but violent and self-loathing, at times childlike, but always dangerous in ways that connected together psychologically for the character. Same with early Jake Roberts. Jake barely even raised his voice most of the time. He understood that restraint is what is unsettling. A calm menace reads more authentic than performative chaos. A lot of bad, crazy gimmicks fail because the performer is too busy showing you that they're crazy instead of making you feel unsafe around them. And there's a huge difference between being a memorable, unsettling character and a person doing kind of a Halloween gimmick or actor exercise on live television. Additionally, in number 2, they commit fully without winking at the audience. So a lot of bad, crazy performances have a layer of almost invisible self-awareness underneath them. You can feel the performer thinking, hey, look at how creepy I'm being right now, because they're presenting insanity as a performance concept instead of inhabiting the mind of an insane person. And the audience can sense that kind of safety net holding you back from the full performance pretty quickly. The wrestlers and actors who actually pull this off commit to the emotional reality of the character with absolute sincerity. They're not asking for applause for being weird. They're not pausing for the audience to react to their spooky line. They're not doing, hey, can you believe this guy energy. They simply, truly are that person in the moment. That's why understated performances often land harder. Think about someone like Jon Moxley, who you might not even consider to be an insane heel or insane face or insane anti-hero, depending on which chapter of his career you're looking at. But I think Jon Moxley currently in AEW is playing the classic insane gimmick, but in such a subtle and understated way. Mox rarely acts crazy in a cartoon sense. He acts like a man who has seen horrifying things and maybe done them and has become emotionally hollowed out by them. His stillness makes people nervous because stillness implies control, something we like to think of an insane or unhinged person being incapable of. Someone screaming and flailing can feel very theatrical, but someone calm while discussing violence feels dangerous. Same with performances outside of wrestling, like Anthony Hopkins in The Silence of the Lambs. Hannibal Lecter is terrifying because he's coherent and emotionally precise. He's extremely observant of people around him. He isn't randomly growling or crawling on the floor or smashing furniture. He understands social rules and social norms perfectly, but chooses when and if to violate them. The next thing an excellent insane heel does is avoid repetitive crazy person behaviors. Once a performer starts relying on a checklist of what I would think of as insanity signals, the audience, or you as a fan, acclimates immediately. So if every single promo includes the same laugh or the same twitching or screaming cadence or open-eyed head tilt or blood spot or that kind of I hear voices stare into the camera, it stops feeling unpredictable and it starts feeling choreographed. It starts feeling like acting. It starts to remind you as a fan, yes, we all know this isn't real. Because real instability is not aesthetically consistent. People who are genuinely volatile don't perform volatility 24 hours a day. And especially not in one continuous trait or behavior. Think about it. Think about some of the worst people you've known. They can be charming. They can be funny. They can seem vulnerable or manipulative. They can be soft-spoken or cruel. They can come off very lucid and clear-headed or dissociated out of reality. They can be very affectionate. They can be paranoid or calm. And sometimes they can go from any of those to explosive and violent within moments. That complexity is what makes real people unsettling and scary. You stop knowing which version of that person you're going to get. I think a huge mistake in wrestling character acting is treating crazy like a volume knob that can only go upward. Because psychologically, unpredictability often comes from contrast. If a wrestler's always screaming, screaming becomes normal. But if someone spends 10 minutes speaking quietly and calmly and suddenly snaps into violence with no tonal warning, that sticks with people. That feels real. And if you've ever been in the presence of someone who has scared you, you recognize that immediately. The next thing a good insane heel gets is grounding their performance in emotions that we as fans and viewers can both recognize and relate to. I think this is the secret ingredient that a lot of folks might miss entirely. We as an audience, and you, whether you're a fan or a wrestler or a writer, you don't connect emotionally to a vague concept of madness. You connect to pain. You can connect to obsession or humiliation or jealousy. You can relate and understand a feeling of being deeply alone or overcome by grief or struggling with your ego or the fear and loss of abandonment. We can understand desperation, to some extent paranoia, but definitely we can understand resentment and bitterness. And some of us deeply understand revenge. Insanity is just the expression of all of those emotions without social rule, without social filter, spiraling out of control. That's why the best unhinged characters in wrestling are usually emotionally legible, even when their behavior becomes extreme. Well, what do I mean by that? You might not agree with what they're doing, but you can understand why they're angry, or why they feel betrayed, or why they crave power, or why they need a validation, or why they snapped. Without that emotional core that we can relate to and understand, the character becomes too abstract. And abstraction kills tension because humans fear recognizable danger more than random nonsense. I think a good recent example of an insane heel that is growing a character is Skylar in WXM. Underneath all of the unsettling mannerisms feels like a painfully human need, whether it's a need to consume or a need to destroy or a need to take, or maybe a need to be accepted by someone who never found their place. That vulnerability makes the character feel real. If Skylar was just another weird, screaming masochist guy or a blank-stared weirdo, he couldn't endure with the fans emotionally. Even characters who are deeply theatrical work best when anchored in something emotionally simple. Look way back to ECW at Raven. He didn't act crazy in a theatrical sense. He acted wounded. His whole presentation was built around alienation and resentment, nihilism, and often a sense of intellectual superiority that was meant to manipulate you emotionally. He dressed like a depressed grunge burnout. He quoted poetry and philosophy. He sat in the corner during promos. He carried himself like someone who believed the world had fundamentally failed him. And if you were the kind of teenager who grew up smoking clandestine cigarettes at the local diner, you know and understand that character. You've met that person, the disaffected youth. Crucially, Raven's violence felt emotionally motivated because of all that character work. He wasn't randomly evil because he wasn't trying to get spooky points. He targeted people because those feelings of rejection or disrespect or a psychological obsession with them. His famous feud with Tommy Dreamer worked because it had years of emotional history underneath it. Raven framed himself as the neglected rich kid turned bitter sociopath, while Dreamer represented the beloved hometown golden boy he resented. And the final thing a great insane heel understands is that they can maintain unpredictability without losing coherence. This is the hardest balancing act of all because total randomness is not interesting for very long. It can be a good spur of the moment gimmick, but it's not going to hold attention because human brains instinctively search for patterns and motivations. That's why we are all armchair psychologists. So if a wrestler behaves in completely disconnected ways from scene to scene, the audience stops investing because there's nothing to track emotionally. There's no pattern or motivation to discover. So a good InSaNe character surprises you within the rules specifically of who they are. You shouldn't always know what they're going to do, but you should understand kind of the emotional ecosystem they operate with. That's a lot of big gobbledygook words, so let's give some examples. If you have a paranoid wrestling character, they may suddenly attack a beloved ally because they suspect betrayal. Pretty classic. You might have a very narcissistic wrestling character who ends up destroying their own success after feeling disrespected. Ooh, a classic. Also, you might be a deeply lonely wrestling character who becomes violently possessive of the one person who showed you love or empathy. You might even do serious harm to someone you care about to protect or please that person. Ooh, that's the good stuff. The actions are surprising, but they're still psychologically consistent with who we have come to understand that character to be. Bad writing and bad wrestling characterization often confuse incoherence with unpredictability. So the character just does random spooky nonsense because the creative team thinks confusion equals intrigue. But confusion without emotional architecture becomes exhausting, tedious, and worse, annoying very quickly. I think this is why so many crazy gimmicks start really hot and really strong and then absolutely collapse within months. Because once we as fans and an audience realize there's no actual interior underneath the mannerisms, there's no motivation or history or backstory to unpack and pattern and analyze, there's nothing left to discover. And the audience also subconsciously knows that authentic emotional volatility looks like a certain thing. Most of us have met someone unstable, maybe manipulative or explosive or obsessive or dissociative or frightening in real life. So when performers do like a cartoon version of a spooky skeleton, it rings very false to us instantly. Humans experience real psychological trauma every day, and so humans are actually pretty good at detecting fake emotional states. And honestly, a lot of wrestling insanity performances drift into kind of like an accidental community theater area because wrestlers often aren't trained actors. They are trained athletes, promo cutters, improvisers, live performers, all extremely difficult skill sets. But psychological characterization is a completely separate craft. I think the wrestlers who nail it either understand human behavior deeply or they have very strong theatrical instincts, or for some, training, or because they're basing their character on a specific emotional truth, either from within themselves or someone they know, instead of kind of these crazy aesthetics we see repeated again and again. I think that's why someone like Bray Wyatt could be simultaneously compelling and other times frustrating. When he was grounded in Southern cult leader charisma and that kind of emotional manipulation, he was magnetic. When it drifted too much into spooky nonsense lore at the behest of higher creative, people disconnected because the symbolism of being spooky replaced the psychology of being someone to fear. And then in a whole other area of the conversation, we have the gender piece. Unfortunately, quite often, women wrestlers performing crazy characters often get pushed toward this very male gaze coded sexy psycho girl or yandere archetype that's very much exaggerated facial expressions, using the baby voice, licking things randomly, red cleavage, kind of like very bargain basement Harley Quinn energy without any emotional grounding or actual internal development. And I want to say very clearly, I don't think this is the fault of many women in wrestling. I think this is quite often a form of creative or storytelling they are pushed into and towards because promos are chasing demographics and ratings. And they forget sometimes about the storytelling and the characterization that is required for us to continue to buy into these characters. So this is not a hit against female wrestlers. It's a hit against a specific kind of character work that becomes OnlyFans coded performance signifiers instead of a legitimate character. Sometimes it can feel like this person is dangerous, but other times it can feel like this person spent way too much time on Tumblr, so they need to sell sex over the need to sell being insane. It's bad character work because it relies on the audience's desire to have sex with the unhinged girl at the bar because they know she's gonna be wild, and not on the audience being genuinely afraid of your presence or curious what you might do next. And quite frankly, once your character is just seen as goon bait, you lose the character ethos and storyline potential you deserve. You can watch 5,000 smutty horror films. It doesn't make you a compelling horror character. In my final thought, I think wrestling audiences, just like me, fans are brutal towards failed sincerity. If a wrestler's clearly trying to be disturbing or edgy and then misses, we get like a secondhand embarrassment for you. As the kids say, it's cringe. Comedy can recover from awkwardness. That's its gift. But coolness cannot. Menace especially cannot. And once your audience, or worse, your fans, the loyal few, start thinking, oh no, don't do it again, instead of, oh my god, what the hell's wrong with this person? The gimmick's in trouble. I think, ironically, the best insane characters usually don't think they're insane at all. They think everyone else is the problem. And that conviction is what sells it. What wrestlers do you think sell InSaNe and then actually sell it, especially those who are able to carry it on over months or years of their character in wrestling? And I like to keep things positive, but if there's an example of someone you think had great potential in this kind of gimmick, but it just wasn't given the support behind creative that it needed, let's talk about that too. We can do it in a way that's respectful to the wrestlers who put their lives and their bodies and their time and their relationships on the line for us to hit these matches. That's it. That's another video. I hope you enjoyed our second episode here of the hardest gimmick in wrestling. I would love to hear your thoughts down below. As always, thank you so much for being here. I absolutely love and appreciate when you like and comment. I love talking with you all, especially over in the community tab or on the JJ Loves Wrestling Instagram. I'm always over there, just a DM away. I would love to know what you would love to see in a video, so share me your favorite promotions or matches you thought were cool, or wrestlers you would love to see get elevated in the spotlight. Let's build some fandoms here. As always, my name is JJ, and I love wrestling. And I'm going to see you right here in the next one.